On January 15, 2009, a routine flight from New York to Charlotte became one of the most remarkable stories of survival in aviation history. US Airways Flight 1549, piloted by Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger and First Officer Jeff Skiles, took off from LaGuardia Airport at 3:25 p.m. with 150 passengers and 5 crew members aboard. Just minutes later, the Airbus A320 would be floating in the frigid waters of the Hudson River, and every single person on board would survive. This is the story of skill, training, and split-second decisions that saved 155 lives. Flight 1549 pushed back from Gate 21 at LaGuardia Airport on a cold Thursday afternoon. The temperature was around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the skies were clear. Captain Sullenberger, a 57-year-old veteran with over 40 years of flying experience, was in command. First Officer Skiles, who had 15,000 flight hours, was actually at the controls for this leg of the journey, as is standard practice in commercial aviation where pilots alternate flying duties. The Airbus A320 taxied to runway 4 and received clearance for takeoff at 3:24 p.m. The aircraft rotated and climbed normally into the winter sky over Queens. Air traffic controller Patrick Harton was monitoring the flight's departure from LaGuardia's tower. At exactly 3:27 p.m. and 11 seconds, approximately 2,800 feet above the ground and climbing through an altitude of about 3,000 feet, disaster struck. The aircraft collided with a flock of Canada geese. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sound of loud thuds and bangs. First Officer Skiles can be heard saying, "Birds," followed immediately by Captain Sullenberger's response, "Birds." The bird strike was catastrophic. Multiple geese, some weighing up to 12 pounds each, were ingested into both engines. Within seconds, both the left and right CFM56 engines began to fail. The smell of burning birds filled the cabin. Passengers reported hearing loud bangs and seeing flames shooting from the left engine. 15 seconds after the bird strike, Captain Sullenberger took control of the aircraft, saying simply, "My aircraft." This is standard protocol when the pilot in command takes over. First Officer Skiles responded, "Your aircraft," confirming the transfer. The cockpit displays showed rapidly decreasing engine parameters. Both engines had suffered severe damage and were losing power. Captain Sullenberger immediately began configuring the aircraft for a possible emergency landing, while First Officer Skiles started working through the dual-engine failure checklist. At 3 hours 27 minutes and 32 seconds, just 21 seconds after the bird strike, Captain Sullenberger made his first transmission to air traffic control. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds. We've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia." Controller Patrick Harton immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He cleared Flight 1549 to return to LaGuardia and offered runway 13. But Captain Sullenberger, monitoring the aircraft's performance, quickly realized they didn't have enough altitude or forward speed to make it back to LaGuardia. The captain asked about Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, which was closer and had a longer runway. At 3 hours 28 minutes and 31 seconds, Harton cleared them to Teterboro's runway 1. The controller was doing everything possible to help, but he was working with limited information about just how rapidly the aircraft was descending. Captain Sullenberger ran the calculations in his head, drawing on 4 decades of experience and his background as a glider pilot and safety expert. He was considering altitude, airspeed, distance to runways, and the glide ratio of the A320. The aircraft was descending at approximately 1,000 feet per minute. At 3 hours 29 minutes and 21 seconds, Captain Sullenberger made the call that would define this entire event. He radioed to air traffic control, "We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson." This transmission lasted just 4 seconds, but it represented an enormous decision. Sullenberger had determined that they couldn't reach any runway. The only option was a water landing in the Hudson River. There was no time for debate, no time for second-guessing. They had less than a minute before impact. First Officer Skiles continued working through emergency procedures while Captain Sullenberger flew the aircraft. Flight attendants Donna Dent, Doreen Welsh, and Sheila Dale began preparing the cabin, shouting the command that passengers would remember for the rest of their lives: "Brace! Brace! Heads down! Stay down!" The aircraft was now gliding toward the Hudson River at approximately 140 knots with both engines completely inoperative. Captain Sullenberger needed to maintain the precise airspeed and angle of descent. Too fast and the aircraft could break apart on impact. Too slow and it would stall and plummet into the water nose first. At 3:30 and 43 seconds p.m., 3 minutes and 28 seconds after the bird strike, Flight 1549 touched down on the Hudson River. The impact occurred near the USS Intrepid Museum, between West 48th and 50th Streets in Manhattan. Captain Sullenberger had executed what's known as a ditching, landing on water with both engines out. He kept the nose slightly up, wings level, and the aircraft aligned with the flow of the river. The A320's belly hit the water first, and the aircraft skipped once before settling onto the surface. The impact was violent but controlled. Passengers described it as feeling like hitting a wall or being in a hard car crash. The cockpit voice recorder captured First Officer Skiles saying, "Got flaps too? You want more?" and Captain Sullenberger responding, "No, let's stay at 2" in the final seconds before touchdown. The aircraft's fuselage remained intact despite the tremendous forces involved. Water began rushing in through a breach in the rear of the fuselage almost immediately. The plane began floating down the Hudson River, carried by the current, with its nose pointing slightly upward and the tail lower in the water. Captain Sullenberger's first words after landing were directed to the cabin crew. "This is the captain. Brace for impact," though the landing had already occurred. He and First Officer Skiles quickly secured the aircraft as much as possible, though there was no time to complete all standard procedures. The evacuation began immediately. The 3 flight attendants in the cabin had already prepared passengers during the descent. They now opened emergency exits and deployed the aircraft's 4 slide rafts. The forward slide rafts deployed successfully, but the rear ones were partially submerged due to the aircraft's orientation in the water. Passengers began evacuating onto the wings and into the deployed slide rafts. The water temperature was approximately 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Many passengers were in business attire with dress shoes, not prepared for standing in icy water. Some stood on the wings in water up to their knees. Flight attendant Doreen Welsh stayed in the rear of the aircraft, helping passengers even as freezing water rushed in. She would later be hypothermic from her extended time in the water. The crew worked systematically to move all passengers toward the exits. The location of the ditching was extraordinarily fortunate. The Hudson River is one of the busiest waterways in the United States, and numerous ferries, tugboats, and other vessels were nearby. Within minutes, several boats had changed course and were heading toward the floating aircraft. The New York waterway ferry Thomas Jefferson, captained by Vince Lombardi, was the first vessel to arrive, reaching the scene at approximately 3:33 p.m. Captain Brittany Catanzaro aboard the ferry Governor Thomas H. Keane arrived moments later. These ferry captains and their crews immediately began pulling passengers from the water, off the wings, and out of the slide rafts. Additional ferries arrived, the Moira Smith, Yogi Berra, and others. Tugboats, police boats, and Coast Guard vessels rushed to the scene. In total, 14 different boats participated in the rescue operation. This rapid response was crucial because passengers were already suffering from cold exposure. Passengers described the rescue as remarkably orderly. While everyone was eager to get off the plane, there was no mass panic. People helped each other onto the wings and into boats. Crew members from the ferries threw life rings and helped pull people aboard. As passengers were being evacuated, Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles remained focused on ensuring everyone got off safely. After most passengers had evacuated, Sullenberger walked through the cabin twice, checking every row and overhead compartment to ensure no one was left behind. The water was rising inside the aircraft. He checked the cockpit, the forward galley, every lavatory, and the entire passenger cabin. Only when he was absolutely certain the aircraft was empty did he evacuate. He was the last person off the plane at approximately 3:55 p.m. Captain Sullenberger stepped onto a rescue boat 29 minutes after ditching the aircraft. The plane was still floating but sinking lower. By the time everyone was rescued, the tail section was almost completely submerged, and water was halfway up the fuselage. All 155 people aboard Flight 1549 survived. Of those, 78 were treated at hospitals, mostly for hypothermia and minor injuries. 5 people sustained serious injuries, including a flight attendant who had a deep laceration to her leg and severe hypothermia. But remarkably, no one died. Passengers were taken to various locations on both sides of the Hudson. Some went to the Intrepid Museum, others to ferry terminals in New Jersey. They were wet, freezing, and in shock, but alive. Many had lost their belongings, which were submerged in the aircraft, but they had their lives. The National Transportation Safety Board launched an immediate investigation into the accident. The aircraft remained partially afloat for several hours before being secured and eventually recovered from the river. Investigators would examine every aspect of what happened. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were recovered and provided crucial information. The NTSB also conducted extensive tests on the engines, which were severely damaged by the bird strike. Examination revealed that both engines had ingested multiple Canada geese, with organic material found throughout the engine cores. One of the key questions was whether Captain Sullenberger could have made it back to LaGuardia or to Teterboro. The NTSB conducted computer simulations that initially suggested a return to LaGuardia might have been possible. However, these simulations assumed the pilots reacted immediately with perfect performance. Captain Sullenberger testified that the simulations didn't account for the time needed to assess the situation and decide on a course of action. When NTSB added a 35-second delay to the simulations to account for human reaction time, the computer-simulated aircraft crashed short of the runway every time. This vindicated Sullenberger's decision to ditch in the Hudson. The NTSB's final report, issued in May 2010, concluded that the probable cause was the ingestion of large birds into each engine, which resulted in an almost total loss of thrust in both engines. The report praised the flight crew's actions, noting that their performance was critical to the survival of everyone aboard. Several factors combined to make the survival of all 155 people possible. First, Captain Sullenberger's experience and skill were crucial. His background as a glider pilot meant he was comfortable flying without engine power. His years as a safety consultant had given him extensive knowledge of aircraft systems and emergency procedures. Second, the crew worked together flawlessly. First Officer Skiles handled emergency checklists and radio communications. The flight attendants prepared the cabin and executed the evacuation professionally despite the extraordinary circumstances. Their training and composure prevented panic. Third, the location was ideal for a water landing. The Hudson River was relatively calm that day, and its width gave Sullenberger room to maneuver. The presence of numerous ferries and boats meant help arrived within minutes. If this had happened over land or over the ocean, the outcome would likely have been tragically different. Fourth, the Airbus A320's design played a role. The aircraft's fuselage remained largely intact despite the water landing. While the rear fuselage was breached, allowing water to enter, the aircraft didn't break apart. The emergency exits and slide rafts functioned as designed. Finally, there was an element of good fortune. The weather was clear, allowing excellent visibility. The bird strike, while catastrophic, could have been even worse if it had occurred at a different phase of flight. If the aircraft had been lower or higher, or over a populated area, the options would have been far more limited. Captain Chesley Sullenberger became an instant hero and household name. He appeared on television, met with President Obama, and was honored with numerous awards. But he consistently emphasized that the survival of everyone aboard was a team effort. First Officer Jeff Skiles, who had been at the controls at the moment of the bird strike, received less public attention but was equally praised by investigators. The three flight attendants, Donna Dent, Doreen Welsh, and Sheila Dale, as well as crew members Sheila Dale and Jeffrey Skiles, were recognized for their professionalism. The ferry captains and crews who rushed to rescue passengers were honored as well. Vince Lombardi, Brittany Catanzaro, and others put their vessels and themselves at risk to save lives. The entire rescue operation reflected the best of human cooperation in a crisis. Air traffic controller Patrick Harton, who had done everything possible to help the flight, was deeply affected by the event. He thought he had lost an aircraft and everyone aboard when Sullenberger said they might end up in the Hudson. Learning that everyone survived was an enormous relief. The miracle on the Hudson led to several changes in aviation safety. The FAA and airports increased efforts to manage bird populations near runways. Wildlife mitigation programs were expanded, using techniques like habitat modification and bird dispersal to reduce the risk of bird strikes. The event also reinforced the importance of simulation training for pilots. Sullenberger credited his training in simulators for preparing him to handle an emergency he had never actually experienced. Airlines and training organizations reviewed their programs to ensure pilots were prepared for rare but critical scenarios like dual-engine failure at low altitude. There were also discussions about ditching procedures and aircraft design. While the A320 performed well in this instance, manufacturers examined ways to improve aircraft survivability in water landings. Recommendations were made about emergency exit design and the location of emergency equipment. The event captured the world's attention and became a defining moment in aviation history. In an era often dominated by negative news, the miracle on the Hudson was an unambiguously positive story. It demonstrated the value of experience, training, and staying calm under pressure. Captain Sullenberger wrote a best-selling book about the experience, Highest Duty, published in 2009. In 2016, director Clint Eastwood released the film Sully, starring Tom Hanks as Captain Sullenberger. The movie dramatized both the event and the subsequent investigation. The term Miracle on the Hudson became part of popular culture, synonymous with snatching victory from the jaws of disaster through skill and courage. January 15th is now remembered as the day when everything went wrong but everyone went home. On January 15, 2009, US Airways Flight 1549 took off from LaGuardia Airport on what should have been a routine flight. 3 minutes and 28 seconds later, it landed on the Hudson River with both engines destroyed. And then, something remarkable happened. Everyone survived. This wasn't luck or a miracle in the supernatural sense. It was the result of decades of training, experience, and preparation meeting a moment of extreme crisis. It was Captain Sullenberger's 40 years of flying experience. It was First Officer Skiles' professionalism. It was the flight attendant's courage. It was the ferry captain's quick response. It was the aircraft designers who built a fuselage that could withstand a water landing. The miracle on the Hudson reminds us that expertise matters, that training saves lives, and that in our darkest moments, human beings are capable of extraordinary things. 155 people went into the Hudson River that cold January afternoon. 155 people came out alive. That's the miracle.